some people might say to you, you know, don't fuck with the Texan because it's not a good idea. I don't mess with anybody else, and I don't appreciate people messing with me.
Billy the Texan Longley, the fastest gun in Melbourne.
Bloodshed. Murders.
He may have killed up to 16 people,
It was like the Western.
including his first wife.
It was a major turning point in his life, I think.
If you got in Billy Longley's way, watch out.
In a matter of minutes, Pat Shannon was dead.
But then the Texan transformed,
He turned informer when he was in prison,
abandoning his criminal mates in the Painters and Dockers Union,
and that was Australia's first ever supergrass.
and triggered a royal commission.
Longley was the hero.
Adam Shan discovers a complicated man.
Longley used to say that he was cursed with a long life for all the bad things he'd done.
An enigma until the end.
He says, I was kicking the kids with them. And where's it got me? Nowhere.
Billy Longley was one of the most feared men on the Melbourne waterfront. He was a dark and complicated character who took some heavy regrets to his grave in 2014, like the death of his first wife, Patricia, from a bullet fired by Billy's hand. Was it an accident, as Billy claimed, or cold-blooded murder? We'll get to that later. There were plenty of other deaths at Billy's hand over which he had no regrets. I interviewed Billy on several occasions in his later years, and it was always fascinating to separate the myth from the fact of this legendary underworld figure they called the Texan.
How did you get known as the Texan?
Well, there was a TV show called The Texan. And the main character in it was a bloke named Bill Longley. It's historic, it's a fact, you know. I've read a bit about him once or twice.
Bill Longley, born in Texas in 1851, killed 32 men before he reached the age of 26 and became the most feared and vicious gunman of his time in or out of prison.
When it came on the TV, Bluey Adams, for instance, he was a detective sergeant in charge of homicide years ago. He started calling me the Texan. It took off from there.
Look, he was a Depression-era kid. He grew up in Depression-era Melbourne. The story is that he didn't own a pair of shoes till he was 12. You know, this is a pretty harsh upbringing. And when you get into that upbringing, you know, you're not going to end up being a doctor or a lawyer.
He got involved in crime at 11 years old. And by the time he was 16, he'd been charged with some pretty serious offences. By the time he was, 18, he used to carry a gun.
All right, Longley, come on out with your hands up.
Longley?
It's no use, Bill. They'll kill us.
No, they won't.
If I've got enough bottle, I could go to the top. And that's essentially Longley's story.
Get back, all of you. The parson gets it in the head.
Yeah, well, I was a good shot, there's no doubt about that, but I practiced a lot, you know.
When it came to the crunch, did you ever miss?
Not that I recall. Well, I don't recall missing, no, I do not. No.
Longley forged his reputation down here on the Melbourne waterfront. In the 1950s, there was only one career path for young men fresh out of jail, and it was here. It was run by the Painters and Dockers Union, and the Victorian branch was notoriously corrupt and full of criminals. It was here that Longley thrived for much of his working life.
You'd all play your part, like there was no bludgeon on the wharf, you know, because you're only bludgeon on a good bloke if you're a bludger down there, and it wasn't tolerated really, you know. You'd get pulled up by somebody.
It was on the Melbourne docks working in Gang 83 that Billy Longley met his first serious partner in crime, Jack the Fibber Warren.
Why he got the name, you know, he was known for telling these outrageous tales. That's where he got the name of the Fibber. I suppose you'd call him an outrageous liar, and he'd be looking at you to see he's got your full attention, you know.
Most Saturdays, the Fibber and the Texan would run a two-up game after the last race at Flemington with the help of some trackside police.
We had the racecourse coppers sweep. They'd come past and get theirs, and everything was apples.
Oh, come on, fellas, get behind me. What's wrong with you? I'm willing to put my shirt on this next one being I'm serious.
He was quite the showman down there on the at the racetrack.
Oh yeah.
I'll even bet my wig if I have to. What are you giving for this, Governor?
He had a good patter, you know. It was entertaining, and people would stop to listen to him. Next minute, they'd be involved in the game themselves.
But this wasn't a game, it was a rort, because the pennies were in fact double headers.
Well, at times they were, yeah. At times, yeah.
And what was your role at these games, Bill?
My role was just being amongst the crowd, just unobtrusive. But you're keeping your eye on things. If there was ever any trouble, you know, you'd handle it as diplomatically as possible.
There's something fishy going on here. Oh, what do you mean? Give us a look at those coins. Oh, there's nothing fishy. I won that fair and square.
You don't need to see nothing, mate.
What might you do?
Open your coat and let him see the butt of your 45.
You bet on tails and you lost. So did I. Now get out of here while you're still in one piece.
What did you call her?
Matilda.
I bet no one wanted to waltz with that, Matilda.
Oh, no, only a mug would argue with a 45.
How much you make on a good day?
Oh, I remember one day I got enough to buy a Holden motor car.
Two-up was a lucrative earner, and it kept Billy away from more dangerous criminal activities, at least for a while. The Fibber and the Texan were great mates. The Fibber taught Longley how to be a thief, but Billy began moving in heavy circles that included notorious gunmen from the docks, like Freddie the Frog Harrison. The Fibber trembled at the sight of him.
How would he behave around the Frog?
Oh, terrified. Oh, quite terrified of the Frog. He's worried enough about me, but the Frog, God, he had such a commanding presence. I can remember at the Prince of Wales Hotel in St Kilda, there was a good SP connection up the lane there. And I'll never forget, Fred came walking up the lane one day. I suppose there'd be 30 or 40 blokes up the lane open a bit there. And Fred's just standing there, and you could feel the silence coming over the crowd. They all just shut up. That's the sort of presence Fred had, you know. He could command a situation.
But the Frog, the most feared man on the waterfront in the 50s, was about to get a lesson of his own, Painters and Dockers style.
Harrison was a very unpleasant piece of work, and he ran afoul of a number of other painters and dockers. So he was going down to pick up his salary one day. He got out of his car, and someone walked up behind him with a loaded shotgun and said, "This is for you, Freddie." And bang, blew his head off. Now, there were 30 people in the vicinity, 30 labourers, 30 painters and dockers in that vicinity who have heard the shot and probably seen Freddie go face down, well, without a face. Not one person saw a thing.
All in the toilet, apparently.
All in the Brasco at the time didn't see a thing.
The death of the frog should have put Billy off the gangster lifestyle, but it didn't. The fibber begged Billy in the early 60s to come to London. He was a member of the infamous Kangaroo gang of thieves that was plundering the luxury emporia of the West End. He promised Billy a non-stop party and no violence on the job. Billy was sorely tempted, but he wasn't a thief. He was a gunman, and his skills were in demand back then. The factions of the painters and dockers battled for control of the union for decades, and Billy the Texan was always on the front line.
Coming up, the war on the waterfront.
And he said, "Now, you ready for everything?" They said, "Yes," so we shot him.
And later, the war at home.
She's dead. That is the worst thing that's ever happened for Billy Longley.
To understand the life and crimes of Billy Longley, we have to look back into the history of the Melbourne waterfront and how a union that started with the best of intentions to protect workers' rights and to guarantee employment ended up as a criminal gang. That union was the Federated Ship Painters and Dockers Union.
You have to understand, this sort of work is really at the bottom limits of unskilled labour. To unload ships is one thing, and this is well before the containerisation of freight. So pulling in things like cargo, rope, that's hard enough. And then they'd have to send in a team to basically scrub the hulls, the inside of the hulls down. There'd often been food there, sometimes livestock. It's a really dirty, nasty job, and not particularly well paid.
The Anzac Army is on the march. A surging khaki tide comes out of the south and flows up the world.
The painters and dockers realised, and I think the wartime history is really important here.
Keep your chin up, England. Australia will be there.
They realised just how critical they were to the entire economy of Australia.
Since World War II, it got more and more corrupt. Part of the reason it got more corrupt was that Pentridge released prisoners, but they couldn't find a job anywhere else, but they could always find one on the docks. At one stage it was estimated that 70 out of 100 Melbourne's top criminals were painters and dockers. And on the docks there were all these little tricks and rules. So for instance, SP bookmaking, they had, when grog was still illegal, they were doing a whole lot of supplying of sly grog. They would run prostitution, they would stand over people.
The practice of ghosting has started. So the union is actually saying this ship requires 25 men to unload it and clean it. But it only actually takes 10. Now, those 10 are all suckers, right? They're actually doing the hard yards, while you've got 15 criminals who are pulling in a wage packet for non-appearance. They make no appearance besides turning up on payday on a Thursday and grabbing their cash.
Cashed-up crooks from the union could be found in hotels across Port Melbourne, while their mates toiled away on the docks. Billy Longley wouldn't have dreamed of coming here without his Colt 45, as three men discovered one night in 1968 here in the Rose and Crown Hotel when they threatened him. Senior Constable Brian Skull Murphy was on duty that night.
We got a call about 9:30 one night, and we'd gone down there and the ambulance had just left. One bloke got shot in the face and the bullet ricocheted around his mouth, blew a few teeth out, came out under his chin, hit the collarbone and lodged in the back of his shoulder. Another bloke had one of his testicles blown off and another bloke was shot in the foot.
There are lots of versions of what motivated Billy to shoot the 3 men inside the bar that night, but it's clear they took issue with him or his wife.
Billy's wife was there, and she most probably started the blur.
Big reputation. Let's see how fast you are.
And they said, well, we're going to go away and come back with a couple of baseball bats and we'll give it to you and your mole missus, blah, blah, blah.
I'll give you one last chance to apologize and get out of town, cowboy.
So after they leave, he said to his wife, go out and get the gun out of the car. So she goes out. When they come back in, he said, now, you ready for everything? And they said, yes, so he shot him.
I think I could use a drink.
Longley was acquitted of the shootings. He got off on a technicality, thanks to his barrister, the legendary Frank Gaubelli. The Painters and Dockers' criminal activities extended to extortion and armed robbery, and they used their dubious ghosting operation as cover.
It's handy to have an alibi that says, I couldn't have done that armed robbery because there I was unloading the SS whatever.
In their heyday, the Dockies were a force across the country, using their union network to find opportunities for crime. They were connected to Sydney's main Nicholas robbery in 1970, when nearly $600,000 was stolen at gunpoint. At the time, it was the biggest robbery in Australian history, and Longley wanted his cut.
Billy was charged with receiving $6,500 of the stash from the main Nicholas robbery. Billy was involved in, you know, a lot of slings and handouts, I think, at some stages. He would look for enterprising ways in which he could earn some dollars. And, you know, he's very enterprising.
By late 1971, Longley put himself forward as the next president of the Painters and Dockers. Control of the union was a ticket to money and power, and he knew it.
I remember as a kid growing up, whenever there was a union election, whenever the president was up for grabs, you'd just sit back and just know what was going to happen. Bloodshed. Murders. Shooting events.
The summer of 1971 was a time to remember down at the docks. In December, Longley ran for the presidency of the Union against Arthur Morris, who was an ally of the Secretary, Pat Shannon. Tensions were set to explode between the Longley and Shannon factions. One of Billy's men was the first to be murdered 3 weeks out from the poll, and the killing would not go unanswered.
Three days before the election, one of Pat Shannon's associates, Alfred Nelson, known as the Ferret, was abducted by 4 men from his flat in Collingwood. The metal grille on his door was no protection. His valiant charger was hauled out of the water at South Wharf several weeks later. But the Ferret was not inside, and his body has never been found.
Alfred Nelson has simply vanished, but no one for a moment imagines he's alive. One detective recalls standing on a slab of newly built concrete like this one and being approached by a painter and docker. "Watch it, mate," says the docker. "You're standing on the Ferret. That may or may not be a joke."
Shortly after Nelson disappeared, Longley's supporter Desmond Cozzy Costello was shot and killed in retaliation for Nelson's demise.
On the 10th of December 1971, Billy Longley, who wanted to be president and his would-be vigilance officer, who was Jim Basley, a bad dude all round and later convicted of murder. They were there at the docks to make sure that the voting went the way they wanted. Apparently Basley had a gun in his hand and his foot on the ballot box just to make sure that everyone voted the right way. Now, his opponent was Pat Shannon, and he wanted his men to be the vigilance officer. They were armed to the teeth and mutually hostile. All of a sudden, with Longley and Basley in place, along came a convoy of 5 cars. It was like the Western. And apparently on the dock that day, there was a massive gunfight.
Even on election day, the bullets are flying. Rival gangs fight a gun battle, first at the Williamstown dockyard and later here at the Union headquarters in Lorimer Street, South Melbourne.
So that was just election day. It took 6 weeks for the poll to be declared, a period punctuated by more murders and bashings. There was a fire at the Union HQ, and Longley's fortress-like home in Port Melbourne was bombed.
There were supposed to be up to 40 documented murders during that power struggle. Is that an accurate figure, do you think?
It could be. Yeah, there were a lot of murders in that period. I prefer you don't try and fasten them all onto me, if you don't mind.
As far as the election went, Pat Shannon's crew emerged victorious. But the talk on the docks was the secretary was on borrowed time.
Are you concerned for your own safety at all, Mr. Shannon?
No.
Are you protected in any way?
No.
Do you have any police protection?
No.
Do you carry a gun?
No. Certainly not.
Are you personally a worried man, Mr. Shannon? Do you
No,
fear that you might be next on the list?
I don't know of any list, and I'm certainly not worried. I think it's got me worried at the moment of these flies.
Last night, in this hotel, Pat Shannon was brutally murdered. This is more or less what took place. At about 5 to 10 last night, the gunman came through the door and pointed a .22 rifle, fired 3 bullets, 2 in the chest and 1 in the stomach. In a matter of minutes, Pat Shannon was dead.
The pub behind me used to be the Druids Hotel, where Pat Shannon was assassinated. The finger of blame pointed squarely at Billy Longley. No one actually said he pulled the trigger, but one of his co-accused later revealed Longley's role in the plot. He went on the run for 12 months. He maintained he did so not out of guilt, but because he feared being murdered by other unionists.
Billy had basically taken off, and he spent some time in Adelaide, and I think he spent some time in Sydney, which he didn't enjoy, and then came back to Melbourne, where he felt a bit safer. And he was kind of hiding in plain sight, wasn't he? He was playing golf and, you know, no one really thought he was there, and he finally sort of checked himself in with his solicitor.
Billy Longley, a ship's painter and docker, is in Pentridge Jail in Melbourne tonight. Today, accompanied by his solicitor and barrister, Billy Longley walked into police headquarters in Russell Street to give himself up.
Well, I was charged with his murder, which I have since day one denied. I was found guilty of his murder. I was sentenced to life imprisonment.
I was in fact called to give evidence, and I believe it was my evidence that eventually convicted Billy. Too bad.
Next, how Longley triggered a royal commission from his jail cell.
He turned informer when he was in prison, and that was Australia's first ever supercross.
Billy the Texan served 13 years in Pentridge Prison for the murder of Pat Shannon. I interviewed Billy in 2004 for the 9 Network's Sunday program, and I asked him what it was like to spend a long stretch in Pentridge's notorious H Division.
Jail's the most dangerous place there is. You go for a shower, you're vulnerable. You're standing in a food line, you're vulnerable. You go to the store, you're vulnerable. You just don't know when anybody could stab you or garrote you or hit you over the head or what. Your mind is focused on one thing in jail: survive, survive, survive.
Personality. It's always about personality. It's personality which determines everything.
Ray Mooney served 8 years in Pentridge with Longley and saw how he survived his enemies in jail.
The greatest crooks in the world, the people who have done the worst things you could ever imagine, if they've got a beautiful and wonderful personality and people like being with them, you can get away with anything for your entire life. Longley could tell a good story. He was good company. He'd play card. People loved being with him. That's how they survive.
Making friends with Chopper Reed certainly helped Longley's cause. Chopper became his friend and protector. And as Longley explained, he did what he could to return the favour.
One day I was working away in here and a very nervous prison officer approached me and he had a plastic bag in his hands and we used to have a fridge in here and he said, Billy said, yeah, a little refrigerator. And he said, Billy says, may I put these ears in the refrigerator? I said, whose ears are they? He said, Chopper Reed's. I said, yeah, certainly, give them to me, and I put them in the deep freeze part of the, hoping they might have been able to sew them back on.
Longley always maintained his innocence over Pat Shannon's murder. He was so aggrieved that he made a momentous decision in jail.
He turned informer when he was in prison, hoping to get a retrial, thinking that they were going to do the right thing by him. Of course, they double-crossed him, and ultimately what happened was he became a supergrass. He turned informer on the painters and dockers and gave them up for every little thing they'd ever done. He gave them up for everything. And that was Australia's first ever supergrass.
Billy the Texan Longley started it all from his Pentridge prison cell by saying a whole lot of nasty things about his old mates on the waterfront. Longley was put away for life for his part in the murder of Painters and Dockers secretary, Pat Shannon. And now, in the last 2 issues of the Bulletin magazine, he's reopened all the old wounds with his inside story on the waterfront.
The Bulletin's expose into the Painters and Dockers Union became a massive national news story, so big that it led to the federal government establishing a royal commission led by Frank Costigan.
Billy Longley was brought to the Royal Commission from Pentridge Jail, where he's serving a sentence for the murder of the Ship Painters and Dockers Victorian Secretary, Pat Shannon.
When giving evidence before Costigan, had mentioned that there'd been about 30 to 40 murders during the gangland wars in the Painters and Dockers, and also exposed the illegal rackets run by people who controlled the union.
So how significant was his evidence to the Costigan Royal Commission?
Absolutely. He was the key figure. Much of the material came through Bill Longley rather than the police. Longley was the hero.
But the Costigan Royal Commission had surprising political consequences for the Liberal government of the day, led by Malcolm Fraser.
one of the great ironies of all of this. The painters and dockers were involved in all sorts of nefarious activities, but many of them were involved as ghost directors of companies that were to be sent to the bottom of the harbour in what was straight out tax evasion, often run by members of the Liberal Party. I mean, not federal MPs, but men who had donated money to the Liberal Party. This was a terrible state of affairs for Malcolm Fraser. He thought this was a lay down misere, you know, electoral success in a nutshell, and of course it just all backfired on him.
It didn't end well for Malcolm Fraser. Bob Hawke soundly beat him at the next election, and the painters and dockers, it was game over for them too.
So the Royal Commission started with the Fraser government. It goes through the period of the Hawke government, and then we actually get to the Keating government before the union is finally deregistered. It hasn't got enough members anymore. But that doesn't mean to say that the painters and dockers, or the shadow of the painters and dockers, still isn't cast over the docks. The docks are still where it's all at crime-wise, whether you're bringing in drugs or guns or whatever contraband it is. That the docks are still the sort of beating heart of crime in Australia. It's just that the painters and dockers have moved on.
Longley may have been a hero to some, but his old union colleagues never forgave him for breaking the code of silence.
The things that Longley said about that organisation, they not only never recovered, but neither did Longley recover either. Back in those days, there's no way in the world you wanted to have the label or the tag of being an informer. Every kid in the school wanted to be known as the best fighter. You show me one kid in the school who wanted to be known as the best lagger.
Next.
Somebody threw a bone at the guy and said, "You forgot your lunch."
He still felt that he could be killed. Payback.
When Billy Longley was released from jail in 1988, the world around him had changed. The union movement regarded him as a pariah. So too did a lot of his underworld connections. But he still had to earn a living. So he reached out to an ex-cop, the same man who'd helped put him behind bars for the Pat Shannon hit, Brian Skull Murphy.
He said, "Mate," he said, I've sat in a can, he said, and thought about all these bastards. He said, none of them were worth a bum full of boiled snow. None of them. He says, and I was kicking the kids with them. He said, "Where's it got me? Nowhere."
How you going?
Not bad, mate. You?
Not bad.
There was only one thing for it. Longley and Murphy teamed up and started a mediation and debt collection business. It was an unlikely alliance, the ex-cop and the convicted murderer.
And so they'd ring at a recalcitrant's doorbell, someone who hadn't paid their debts to whoever, usually gambling debts, I guess, and they'd just slip the card into the letterbox. And that was enough, usually. Billy thought that was immensely amusing, that his reputation was almost a guarantee of quick and full payment.
In his later years, Longley would often be found at his favourite cafe in Ascot Vale. It's here that Susanna Lobez first met him.
And it was interesting, Adam. He sat facing the door, and I thought, isn't that typical? You know, an old crim, or even an old cop for that matter, would always fit facing the door, even though it's this little bun and cake shop in Ascot Vale.
The things you do more or less automatically, I suppose. The minute you get careless, that's the end of you.
What was your closest call?
I was reading the paper one night and a bullet came through the window and took the paper out of my hand. That was fairly close.
I became close to Billy into his 80s. And he still felt that he could be killed. Payback. That was quite present at a lot of our meetings, that he still had this belief. So, very sad.
How much did he regret his decision to give evidence against the union?
He never expressed regret to me about that. He felt it was something he had to do. He really wanted to make peace with his union, go out with his union, perhaps understanding him, I think. Understanding that his motivations were for the betterment of the union, the way Billy saw it.
You and I both got calls. He was desperate to go to the Maritime Union Old Wharfies lunch. What was the reaction you got when you tried to get him to that lunch?
Basically that there would still be too many people around that hated Billy. And I certainly tried on his behalf, and I understand the union's response as well. So no was no, but it was a very clear no as well.
Do you know, when you think about informants, and informants like Billy Longley was at the Costigan Commission, then you have to ask yourself, why would they do it? Because in Melbourne, there is nothing worse than a dog, a supergrass, an informant, someone who turns over. There was one case, I think it was the Kane brothers, and they were dockers as well, and somebody in the courtroom threw a bone at the guy and said, "You forgot your lunch."
Longley used to say that he was cursed with a long life for all the bad things he'd done. And in his later years, he expressed great regret for his crimes. He suffered anxiety and depression for decades and sought ways to redeem himself. He was an old man, but Billy needed a fresh start. So he took his cautionary tale to the classroom.
This is my neighbour, Bill Longley. He's here to share some of his experience with us. He's had a fairly difficult sort of a life, and here he is.
My name is Billy Longley. Over my lifetime, I have been charged with 2 murders, 3 attempted murders, and Australia's biggest hold-up.
Those 15 years that you're in jail for, what would you like to do if you didn't have to go to jail?
Well, I'd just like to lead a successful life. Maybe own a small business, own my own house. More of a success story than rather than be a successful failure. And that's about all you are when you're going, when you're in jail for 15 years. And I tell you with as much sincerity as I can muster, I hope none of you ever go to jail.
What were the key points that he regretted in his life?
Well, I would think for Bill, there was enormous regret about not being able to serve in the Second World War as a soldier. He would talk about that quite a bit and said, you know, I was an apprentice at the munitions factory and it was an essential service and they wouldn't let me go to war. And I think Billy felt that he would have a strong sense of purpose or belonging in the army. He sees others were going, he wanted to do his bit, and he was denied by the authorities his opportunity to serve his country. And that was very, very strong with Billy.
Well, look, the paradox very often when you're dealing with someone with such a dark past as Billy is that their personality is completely and utterly unexpected. He took up a passion for ballroom dancing, and every week he'd go to I think it was the Moonee Ponds Town Hall. So Billy would go swirling around the room with some innocent woman in his arms who had no idea that those arms had been involved in less romantic pursuits.
There's one last puzzle to solve. Did Longley shoot his first wife on purpose, or was it an accident?
He was sorry for a lot of things that he'd done, but he couldn't admit it.
It's difficult to reconcile who Billy Longley was in later life, a quiet, dignified man, with the cold-hearted killer he was in his heyday on the Melbourne docks. And it was here in 1961 that his destiny was sealed. His first wife, Patricia, died in a house that used to be here on this site in South Melbourne at the end of a gun fired by her husband.
He told me the story, and it was the first time that he'd ever spoken to anyone about it before. It was a really warm Sunday evening. He'd come home from working on the docks, and it was a big party in their place in South Melbourne. And at one stage during the evening, he goes looking for money. I think he cracked the joke of passing the hat around, you know, we need some more beer. And they've said, we don't have any. He went looking for money in the wardrobe, as you do, in the bedroom, and he finds a white shoebox. Inside the shoebox is a gun. Now, Billy is ropeable. It's not his gun. It's not Pat's gun. Whose gun is it? He went and confronted his wife and said, whose gun is this? And she said, I'm keeping it for Les Gillis, who was an ex-boyfriend, someone she'd lived with, another wharfie. He went through the roof. She denied that she was seeing him. He put it to her that she was. Next thing you know, her father, Johnny Diamond's in there. He's got a gun, he's waving the gun around. Next thing you know, they're on the veranda and Pat's in the bedroom. So there's Johnny Diamond's and there's Billy Longley. They're arguing about the gun. It becomes more heated. There's pushing, shoving, wrestling. The gun goes off. Bang. A caliber .32 bullet goes through the glass window, pings into Patricia underneath her left armpit, goes through her third and fourth rib, pings off the fourth and fifth, goes through both her lungs. She's dead. That is the worst thing that's ever happened for Billy Longley. He was back there in the moment when he was telling me that. The love of his life is gone.
Longley was charged because he fired the fatal bullet. The case went to trial, and he was initially found guilty of manslaughter. He appealed on the basis the shooting was an accident and was acquitted in a retrial.
It was a major turning point in his life, I think. You know, not only did he lose the love of his life, but he was accused, and ostensibly to a larger part of the public, he was responsible for her death, and he knew that wasn't so, and he's always maintained his innocence.
It's a very painful period of my life. I happen to love the lady very much. One time I considered suicide. It's one of the most difficult periods of my life.
Feet flat, punch it across, arms through, elbows up.
Longley only served time for one murder, that of Union Secretary Pat Shannon. But his life was steeped in blood. He is said to have killed up to 16 people.
How much do you know about murders he may have committed?
None. Nothing.
You never asked him?
Never, ever asked him. There's no need to ask. Everybody's got their own opinions. And sometimes if there's a hope of a friendship there, it's going to be ruined by sticking your bib into somebody else's business, you know?
This fellow's a reporter. He'd like a statement. Got anything you want to say to him?
Thank you. Well, I haven't got much to say, except I kind of hate to die knowing I got so many enemies and almost no friends. Papers say I killed 32 men. You probably want to know why. I know now that was wrong. Man tries to get even with the world, he just winds up getting even with himself.
How many secrets will you take with you at the end of that? There's certain things that can never be said.
That's right. Plenty.
Don't want to unburden yourself today, Bill?
No. No thanks.
He never revealed the deepest, darkest secrets.
I offered Billy a chance to to tell the world after he passed. I thought maybe for him there was an opportunity to do that. I remember when Billy was dying and visiting him and saying, mate, is there anything you want to pass on, anything you'd like me to say? And Billy goes, no.
He was sorry for a lot of things that he'd done, but he couldn't admit it. He said, oh, fuck, you know, could have been different, could have been different. I said, lots of things could have been different, but what it is, and we're stuck with it, Bill.
What did he tell you when he was dying?
He says, you know, he said, we mightn't have started off too good. He says, but this has been one of the best parts of my life. He says, I didn't have any tension with you. I said, me, neither with you, Bill. And he was lucky when he died, that he died the way he did with the people around him.
For me, it was like talking and sitting with Union history without judgment. I kind of hoped I'd give him some comfort as well and let him know that I believed that he was always a Union man, above and beyond all else.
That would have meant a lot. Any particular story you want to share with us that I haven't asked you about?
Not that wouldn't see me do time.
We'll leave it there.